Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar today. We're really excited to have you. We've had over 400 people register for this event today, and so this should hopefully be a good one. My name is Davis. I'm on the investment team at Innovation Endeavors. And today we're addressing a topic that has come up so frequently for the startups that we work with, both in and outside of our portfolio over the last few months as a result of COVID. And that's this question of, how do you operate successfully as a remote team? We've had questions raised all the way from how do you onboard remotely to how do you have the tough, difficult conversations when you can't be there in person, to how do you maintain the social and team camaraderie that's so important when you can't be together. These are really hard questions. The answers aren't obvious. But the good news is that there's people that we can learn from who've gone through these things in the past. And so that's the purpose of this panel today. And so today we have three specific panelists who have all played a key role in running, operating, or managing highly distributed remote teams. The first is Darren Murph. He's the head of remote at GitLab. GitLab is a company famous for being all remote from the very start. And even today, with over 1,000 employees, they have no offices anywhere in the world. Our second panelist is Marten Mickos. He is the current CEO of HackerOne and the former CEO of MySQL. MySQL is another one of the first companies to really embrace a remote first operation. Where when they were up into the hundreds of employees, still 70 to 80% of their workforce was remote, and they had offices all around the world. And then finally, we have Harpi Singh. Harpi is currently a partner at Innovation Endeavors, and before that, he founded and exited two companies, Slice Data and Fiber Tower, each of which were very geographically distributed. So Slice Data had offices both all over the US as well as in the Ukraine and some remote employees, and then Fiber Tower had offices in 13 different locations around the world. And so we think this should hopefully represent the full gamut from a pure all remote perspective all the way to a more distributed perspective, but with a little bit less remote. The format for today will be as follows. We'll start with about 35 minutes or so of a panel where I'll be asking some of the top questions that you all submitted in the registration for Zoom. And then after that, we'll move into an open Q&A, and where we'll bring up some of the top voted questions in the Zoom Q&A thing for you to ask live to the panelists. And so if you want to ask a question, please open the Zoom Q&A thing, enter your question, or upvote the other questions that you think are the best. So with all that said, we'd love to dive into it. And why don't we start with a topic that I think is really simple, but top of mind for most teams we talk to, which is just getting used to being a remote worker. We hear a lot of things internally. I think two things we hear a lot. One is, now my day all blurs together. I'm a passionate employee. I end up working too much because there's no delineation in my day. And the other thing is, I'm used to being able to focus when I'm in the office, but it's a lot harder when I'm at home and there's so many distractions. So Darren, we'd love to start with you and get your perspective from GitLab in terms of what are best practices as an individual to be a productive remote worker when you can't go into the office, but you're used to that kind of routine schedule in your life?
Yeah, Davis, great question. And thanks all for being gracious with your time and joining today. This is a tough one, even for people like GitLab who have been doing this for many, many years. It's really easy for the lines between work and life to blur. And one thing that I've recommended for suddenly remote employees is to put a calendar invite in your morning and your evening where your commute used to be. And don't just put the block in there, but actually intentionally type something that you're going to do at that time other than work, whether that's meditating or reading or cooking or just resting more. It can be anything other than work. And make sure you put 4 or 5 different reminders on there. You want it to actually bug you to make sure you properly disengage. I was recently speaking with our chief revenue officer, and he said that of late, since COVID began, he had not been doing this before. But he noticed that if he ended his last sales call and then 15 seconds later was in his living room with his family, it was just too soon. He needed a little bit of a buffer to properly digest the day before he engaged with his family to make sure they were getting the dad, not the chief revenue officer. And so he started putting a calendar invite where he would just walk a couple of laps around his house just to get outside, get some fresh air, and do something different. So that's a small start, but I really do think it helps and goes a long way to get your brain kind of out of work mode and helps you ramp into your day and ramp out of your day. From a team standpoint, the closer you can move to asynchronous workflows, the better. And for individuals, there's only so much you can do without needing deeper company support when it comes to this. If you've simply moved into a virtual world and you've copied over and kind of pasted into Zoom all of your standing in-person meetings, it's going to wear on you after a while. And the goal would be to question, are these meetings really necessary? Can we do this work in a different way now that we're virtual, but we can touch on some of those deeper topics down the road.
Fantastic. And I think another issue that comes up kind of related to what you're touching on, Darren, is this idea of cabin fever. I'm now stuck in one room the entire day. And Martin, I've seen you talk about the fact that, first of all, maybe only 20% of the workforce is really optimally designed to do well in a remote setting. We're now in a situation where 100% of most workforces need to be remote. Martin, do you have any tips for an employee who maybe remote isn't ever going to be their ideal setting, but for the next few months or even longer, they're in this situation? What can they do differently to not have that cabin fever and to exceed or excel, even though this isn't really their ideal environment?
Well, first of all, I would say, look at history. We all have ancestry of people who were fishermen and women, hunters, goat herders. They worked on their own all the time. They had nobody to talk to other than some animals. They had not just nature around them. So genetically, we are equipped to be on our own. So if you say it's hopeless, no, it's not hopeless. It may be not your best environment, but it's not hopeless. Your ancestors did it. And I think Darren said it very well. You have to build your own routines and habits and take care of yourself. We built them at workplaces. When you go into an office, there are things there to take care of you. But at home, you have to figure out the ways to take care of yourself, like taking the breaks, switching between work you and private you, rewarding yourself, moving physically a little bit around so that you keep yourself energized. I believe it's individual for everybody how they do it, but if you just tell yourself that you need to take care of yourself, I think you will figure out what to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it bridges into the next topic that I'd like to spend some time on, which is obviously there's some things an employee can do themselves to make themselves more productive, but a big part of productivity in a remote environment is actually around leadership and culture, and how as a leader, you create a productive environment for your whole team. So I'd love to spend some time on that topic. And Harpi, maybe we start with you. I think one of the questions that we've gotten submitted a lot is, how do I maintain team culture and social bonds in a remote first environment? It's maybe more easy to understand how I can keep working remotely, but we so often lose the casual conversations that we're used to, but are really important, especially for a young startup where there needs to be that cohesion and unity. I'd love to get a sense of, how you guys approach that problem at the companies that you manage.
A great topic, and I think this is the enabler to do what Darren and Martin are talking about. You can only be effective remotely or in a distributed environment if there is that culture and trust supporting it. So, at both my companies, we were very intentional about this. We implemented a one-team culture by design. So what that meant is there were no first-class, second-class citizens. And especially in a distributed culture, what that requires is, a mission that is very simple, core values that are easy to remember, and then you need these stories and rituals to reinforce those. And, we were in a different environment, but we put a lot of emphasis on personal contact. And that could be in person, but that could also be reinforced over video. And I'm happy to talk about some of those techniques. And I think that gave us the foundation, which enabled remote work. And to your second part of the question, I think ensuring that people feel like a part of the team for the leadership usually translates into doing what you say you will do. So the concept of one team, one culture, the way it manifested for us is, we had one team, one comp structure, regardless of the office that you were in. So it could be here, it could be in Ukraine. We tried to emulate the same comp structure. And second was openness and transparency. We wanted to make sure that a person in Ukraine didn't feel that somehow he had an information gap because he wasn't at the headquarters. So my co-founder, Eric, who's a CTO, he was fanatical about harmonizing this. So, for example, in Ukraine, they don't offer health insurance, and our employees here had it. So Eric went out of his way to figure out how to implement that. And the point of it is the employees there noticed. They noticed that somebody cared, which then is this virtuous cycle. And they're like, okay, somebody's taking care of me. And especially in these remote locations, I think one of the things I'd be curious to hear from Martin and Darren, the economies are not stable. There's a lot of skepticism about the government and so on. So when they notice that, okay, you care, I'm not gonna get screwed, I think that engenders a lot of loyalty. So that's what we did. And I think I go back to the first seminar in this series by Eric Schmidt, what we tried to do at the highest level was, hire the smartest people and enable them to do their best. So that meant there was no difference whether you were in SF, New York, and Ukraine. You could do what you were there to do.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Harpi. And I think one of the first things you mentioned there was this idea of intentionality in terms of planning and making sure you had this cohesion. Darren, this is something I see GitLab reference a lot in your handbook and other documents that you put online, especially intentionality around creating those informal communications. Can you speak a little bit to how GitLab approaches that and why it's so important for you all?
Yeah, intentionality is critical across the entire business of remote, but it's really, really critical for informal communication. And what I'm seeing a lot of leaders struggle with is in a virtual environment, those spontaneous moments don't happen as much. But I think there's a fallacy on that in the office, which is if you have an office, it probably has a lobby and there's perhaps a coffee maker there, a trash can, maybe a water machine. And there are hallways that are designed a certain width that lead to certain communal spaces. What I'm trying to say here is that's not spontaneous. Someone intentionally designed your office so that people could build relationships with each other. If you walked into an office, there was no lobby, straight into an elevator, straight to your cube, a lot less informal communication would happen at your office. So it may seem non-obvious to you, you might be taking it for granted, but the office was designed intentionally to build that. So in a remote setting, you have to make it the responsibility of your team, your people group, to put some of these things on the calendar. At GitLab, we do things like virtual talent shows where every month we'll have a calendar invite, there's an agenda, you can sign up, bring your talent. A couple of weeks ago, we had the entire marketing team, 130 people across 6 continents, show off talents. We had a panel of judges, there were prizes involved, some healthy competition. This bonds people together in a really significant way. And I would say you couldn't even do something that elaborate if you had an office. And that's not difficult to set up. It was legitimately one Google Doc and a calendar invite. But it just takes a little bit of effort to create the atmosphere where something like that can happen. The other thing I recommend to teams is think a little bit outside of the box, outside of work. Right now, a lot of people are focused on the crisis and how can we make sure our people maintain relationships. But at GitLab, what we see is that the more you allow people to engage with their own local neighbors and communities, and then share photos and stories of that back with the broader team in Slack, you learn a lot more about who someone is by what they do outside of work. And then that helps you work better with them inside of work. So I would actually encourage your teams to get out there where possible and where safe, and fill some of your social quota from things outside of work. Because when you share that in work, it really gives people a much clearer view of who you are and how you like to be engaged with.
That's fantastic. And I think kind of what you're touching on is this idea of you really need as an employee and a team to be willing to put yourself out there over video conference and Zoom. And that's not so easy sometimes. And Marten, this is one thing I've seen you talk about with respect to leadership. That is, as a leader, especially in a heavily distributed or remote team, putting your full self out there is extremely important to set an example. And more broadly, I think you've talked a lot about the way you need to operate as a leader probably needs to change a little bit in a remote environment, or at least you need to accelerate certain things that you wouldn't otherwise be spending as much time thinking about it in the early days. Can you talk a little bit about, to the CEOs in the audience or even the managers, how do you need to change as a leader if you're in a remote company, and what are some of the things that are really important, especially in these sorts of situations?
To be clear, I don't think you should change.
I don't think you should change.
You should be as authentic as you
always
are. But you should change your tools and habits and the mechanisms you use. Is there an echo here now for others?
Is there an echo here now for others, or is it just?
Yep, getting an echo, Marten.
I wonder where it's coming from. It's gone. Thank
We're
you.
good.
Yes, so the leader must go all in, and you must be there imagining what it is like for your people. So you must learn to think beyond what you see. And when you do that, you can figure out ways to connect with them, and not on the business side. It's easy to connect on the business side. I can read our OKRs for you and our revenue numbers, and it sounds very impressive. But the real thing is, how do you connect with the human beings you have behind all these screens and emails and Slack messages? And when you intentionally develop that ability to imagine what it is like, and then you realize you need the non-business channels. Like at HackerOne, we have one Slack channel called High Fives, where we give high fives to each other. It's always online. You're drawn to Slack because you want to see them. We have all the customer wins. We have all the SDRs when they get a response on a cold email, they're shown there. And the most wonderful channel we have now is called HackerOne Confessions. You can go in there and confess whatever you like. No bragging, so don't mask bragging inside a confession, just a pure confession of something on your mind. And it's opening up the souls of people so wonderfully that we feel like a group. So last Friday, it was Juneteenth, and we decided that we must take it very seriously, because hacker-powered security, what we do at HackerOne, is based on the belief that everybody has a fair chance. Now we realize that it's not true in the United States or elsewhere. So we took that day very seriously. We had so much program during that day. People were sharing their observations, crying, getting very emotional. It was all happening on these very formal channels like Zoom and Slack and email. But it created this amazing team spirit across the whole globe during 12 hours. So you can do that, but you have to go all in. You have to show your authentic self with the weaknesses and vulnerabilities and whatever you have. And then others are more ready to open up to you, and you form those bonds and then you realize it's exactly like in a physical office. It's just that in a physical office, you don't think about running into somebody in the parking lot and exchanging a few words and being angry at somebody for leaving the restroom untidy or something. Like, you have these non-business interactions in the office, so you must do the same digitally. And if we ever wonder how to do this, we should just ask the young, because they grew up with this. They already know it. It's more difficult for us who are digital immigrants, but those who are now teenagers, they are playing all these tools and everything to their advantage, and they don't have a problem.
My kids leave the room. My kids leave the restroom untidy, so I'm getting that fixed.
Yes, exactly. But then you should share it with your colleagues so that they see the reality of your home office, maybe. I believe very much in this, in the being intentional about being spontaneous and sort of showing something that others can't see, so that you create a real bond with people online.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you're touching on kind of the personal side of openness and transparency. I think another thing that I've seen all of you talk about before is the importance in openness and transparency from a business perspective, in terms of the way decisions are made, why a certain strategy is being followed. All those things is more important than ever when you're in a highly remote environment. Harpi, I know this is something we've talked about before. I'd love to get your perspective of both, why does that matter so much in a distributed environment? And two, what were some of the ways that you guys were able to achieve that at your companies?
So I'll just build on, I think, what Martin said, which is, culture and openness is reinforced on sort of shared experiences and sort of show and tell. And I think the single best practice that I'd point to is, perhaps actions speak louder than words. This is one area where what you do versus what you say matters more. And I think and this can vary from company to company. I think the two examples I would think of for us, one is we decided to put our chief database engineer for my last company in Ukraine, which means his team manages the OLTP database, which is the crown jewels of any company. And that's the strongest signal that we could send, that there are no first class, second class citizens. We are not paying lip service to HQ does this and remote does this. The single biggest asset of the company sits in Ukraine, not here. So that's an example of actually backing up our words. And the second one, I think, the high five concept that Martin, you mentioned, we had a different implementation of it, and that is what we call shout out awards. So this is where anybody in the company could give anybody else a $50 Visa card. And it was inspired by this idea that, good things, amazing actions can happen at any level in the company, in any geography, and we need to bring them out. And there was only one requirement. People had to send an email or they had to put on a Slack channel why they were doing this award. So what it brought out was these amazing stories of gratitude. It brought out, people making this extraordinary effort, or how somebody's reinforcing the culture. So, we decided to do it by example. It's less about the leadership grabbing the megaphone and saying, hey, here is who we aspire to be. It's really sort of displayed in our actions, and then sort of through high fives or shout outs, amplifying what people in the company are saying.
I'd love to now move on to another topic that has both raised a lot in the registrations, has also been asked and upvoted quite a bit in the Q&A right now, which is ties to leadership. And that's around, how do you have the tough, more emotionally charged conversations in a remote environment? It's one thing to have the informal conversations and the business conversations over video or something like that. But when you have to give hard feedback, when you have to fire someone, when you have to share really bad news, that's very difficult to do in an asynchronous manner or even over Zoom. So Marten, I'd love to get your perspective, as a leader, how do you manage situations like that in a heavily remote or distributed environment?
It's hard, but I've hired an executive who I haven't met in person yet. I'm going to meet the person today for the first time. We'll be walking at 6 feet distance and chatting, but I've never met the person, and we hired her. I've also fired people now in these times where I've had the discussion online. I don't have any other advice than that you must in advance build a communication style where people are comfortable hearing and speaking and receiving. And then when the day comes that you have to give some very tough feedback, then you do it like you would do it physically. You sit down, you don't rush it, and you don't sugarcoat it. You sit down and say, the purpose of this call is to terminate your employment or discuss your performance, or I have a worry or a concern. And when you can imagine how it feels for the other person, and not that I'm that good at it, but I try, then you can speak in a way that the other one can receive. Because you have to present your case so that the other person sort of has a chance to get it. And personally, many times I did do it, whether I'm in a physical office or not, but I write down sort of a script for myself before, and I'm always ready to share my script with the person, because when you get it through a phone call, it's too much. You may not sort of record everything you hear, but then I can give you the text and say, here's how I wrote it down for myself, so that you could read it at your time, and let's come back to it tomorrow. So I do think that being just methodical there and not rushing it, like taking the time, speaking slowly, breathing slowly, stopping to just sit there, just sit and let it sink in. I know it's difficult for many with silence. I'm from Finland. I can sit here for a minute just looking at you people without saying anything. Like this, longer. I was just being silent.
Oh, I apologize. I was too uncomfortable.
No, that's fine. But I do think there's it is the same things. You just have to change the mechanisms. We are still human beings, even digitally. We still have the same emotions. You can convey your body language in other ways. Like I have my physical emoji that I use every now and then when I'm on a call to show my support. So be creative and be genuine, and you could do it.
Those are really helpful tips. I'd love to now move into another topic that I think comes up a lot and is really critical in terms of the way you operate remotely. And that's kind of around collaboration, and tied to that always is meetings. And Darren, why don't we start with you? I know GitLab has a very specific way they handle meetings and put guardrails around meetings. I'd love for you to share that and maybe share a little bit about why GitLab does that and how that's useful in terms of operating well as a remote team.
Yeah, so we make meetings pretty difficult to have, and we do that as a forcing function to work more asynchronously. One of our goals is to do as much as we possibly can as an organization asynchronously, so we minimize the need for synchronicity. For our meetings, you can't have a meeting without an agenda. So if you get a meeting invite, it has no agenda doc attached to it, you can just politely decline it or ask the host to ping you back once there's an agenda. And we follow through that agenda. It allows people to contribute asynchronously to that agenda. They can put questions in even in advance of the meeting. If they're not going to be there, someone else on the call can verbalize it for them, transcribe the answer, and then that person can see what the answer was. So effectively, they can participate in the meeting without even being there. We have employees across 67 countries, so that inclusivity on giving people a voice in a meeting is really, really paramount to what we do. But we make it really hard to have the meeting, and then the meeting organizer then has to have key takeaways merged into our handbook, yet another step. So we do all of this to force people to start their ideas on a GitLab issue or a GitLab merge request. We would much rather them write down the reason for the meeting in a GitLab issue, tag the relevant people, and then let people put feedback in as it suits their schedule, instead of trying to cram as many people as possible into a 1-hour block and get some decision out of it. It's just a fundamentally better way to do work. I think a lot of companies right now are stuck in what I call phase 1 of remote adaptation, which is skeuomorphism. You're trying to copy the office environment and paste it into a virtual environment. And that includes bringing all the meetings over. You don't rethink what meetings are necessary. You don't rethink your meeting hygiene. You don't rethink, is it possible to do this without a meeting? But give yourself some time. It took GitLab a while to become experts in this, and you'll gradually and sustainably move towards a later phase, which gets you closer to asynchronous.
That makes sense. And Harpi, I'd love to move for you for a second and get a sense of, do you agree with kind of the way GitLab approaches meetings in terms of that was also effective for you with a more distributed team, or would you say you handle things a little bit differently? And how did you go about thinking about meetings with such a geographically distributed workforce?
Yeah, and I'm definitely curious to learn more about how GitLab does this. I think our approach was different. Our fundamental approach to it was that you need sort of the personal relationships to be effective at work. So our meetings are probably going to sound a lot less efficient than GitLab, but we felt that, hey, meetings don't have to be transactional. And it gives you an avenue to build these relationships. So there are 2 or 3 things we did. One was we always had this sort of exchange program between offices. So at any given time, we may have 2 or 3 people from San Francisco in Ukraine or in New York and vice versa. And I think what we learned through that is there's just a lot of value in breathing the same air. When people work in the same time zone, they go out for a hike together, they go for a basketball game together and so on. They just, they learn what it is like to be an engineer in a different geography, and it just creates this empathy, which I thought was very relevant when they came back. And then more on the virtual side, we had a weekly stand-up on the engineering side. It was a 60-minute meeting, and we would always, and this worked when we were smaller, we always let everybody speak for 60 seconds. What are you working on? What do you need help with? And I think the content was interesting, but there was certain value in hearing somebody's voice, getting a sense of what are they feeling. And it created this sort of empathy again, which you could take offline and then perhaps tag each other and work more effectively. And I think the third mechanism through which this interaction happened was through these distributed design reviews and architecture reviews. That gave another sort of reason for people to interact. So that's how we did it. I'm very curious, Darren, to talk offline on sort of the pros and cons.
I'm
Sure,
hearing something, Harpi, in what you say that I relate to, which is I do a lot of meetings where the goal is not to make a decision. Mm-hmm. The goal is to get everybody heard and get everybody listening to each other and a feeling, and then the decision can happen offline. And I was wondering why we have them. And I realized, as I was thinking, that we do them when the group is small or they know each other very well. We can do those sort of where it's pretty loose and there may not even be an agenda to start with. And then when it's a larger group or they don't know each other very well, then we are more regimented about agenda and notes and so on. But I love these meetings where we get together without seemingly any agenda, but we come out of it saying, okay, I know what to do. I'll make this decision. I'll get this thing going. But and then I realized, okay, meetings coming in all shapes and forms, all colors and sizes, and you have to adjust your tools and your procedures against what kind of meeting it is. It's sort of wrong to call it meeting when there are so many different ones. We should have a separate word, like Eskimos have separate words for snow in different forms. We should similarly have separate words for the different meetings.
Yeah, that's accurate. I do think there's value in separating decision making and decision gathering. And we do that as well, where we can have a meeting. It's like, we're just here to gather thoughts. No one has to fear that they're going to leave with a laundry list of action items. That's a separate instance or a separate meeting. And Harpi, if you Google GitLab meetings, we have a handbook page that details everything we have there. And also for those listening, if you Google GitLab collaboration and whiteboarding, there's an entire page on how we do that as well. So
I read it. It was mind-boggling.
So I think kind of tied to this idea of how can we reduce meetings or take these different approaches to meetings, I think inherent in that is also an adaptation of processes around documentation. And it's clear that almost every company that is highly remote or distributed takes a really documentation first culture. I think GitLab really takes us to the extreme. So Darren, maybe you could talk a little bit about the GitLab handbook and more broadly, why teams that are remote and highly distributed should care so much about writing things down.
Yeah, so we're careful at GitLab not to say we focus on documentation. We focus on working handbook first. If you just blindly try to implement documentation, it's very dangerous because everyone could document something differently. You have the finance team documenting in a Notion doc. You have the HR team documenting in an Almanac doc. You can have splinters of communication all over the place. So at GitLab, we focus all of our documentation into the GitLab handbook. If you Google GitLab handbook, you'll find it. Bring a tall cup of coffee. It is a deep rabbit hole, but we document everything that we do and we make it all public to the world. You'll find our vision there, our strategy, our OKRs. The reason why we do that is we want to have a single source of truth for everything, not multiple sources of truth. And as your company scales, you'll realize how vital this is. When GitLab was 10 people, we could probably figure out if there were multiple copies of something, which one is the most recent. At 1,300 people across 67 countries, that's completely impossible. And not having a single source of truth would ultimately be our demise. So if you're not at 1,300 people yet, start now. Start documenting in a systematic way and ingraining the value of working handbook first. We won't allow an announcement to be made unless it's made in the handbook first. So if someone tries to announce something in Slack, and in that message, there's not the handbook link and the merge request where this was changed, without fail, the first comment is, where's the handbook link? Where's the merge request? And we reinforce that amongst each other. And it allows us to be more efficient and allows us to self-serve a lot more than many other organizations. I get that it's going to feel like an unnatural motion for many, and you'll feel like documenting is inefficient, it's slow. But long-term, it's incredibly efficient. You have to understand, we can onboard people now at year 10 of GitLab using the knowledge, culture, and values that were documented on day 10. That is an immense amount of efficiency because someone thought to document 10 years ago.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you're touching on another thing that's come up quite a bit, which is onboarding. Onboarding is already hard, even in a physically co-located scenario. But I think a lot of teams, the approach they take is kind of, hey, come sit next to me for the first few weeks and just absorb everything I do, right? That's a lot harder in our scenario. And it's also hard to onboard someone into the culture and getting to know the team when they're brand new remotely. Marten, I'd love your perspective on how you guys have approached that, the companies you've worked with, and what have you seen that's effective?
I think you have to be very methodical about it. And not that I personally am, but I'm good at hiring people who are methodical. So it has worked out well. I completely believe in what Darren and others said about documenting things. Like software is the ultimate expression of human intent, and documentation is just a looser form of software. Like if we want to create something of value, something that lasts longer than ourselves, we must document it. And if we think we are typing or writing or producing a lot right now, it's nothing to what we need to do going forward. We should just do more of it. And I agree, it allows us to be asynchronous, it allows us to be open, it allows us to be fair and equitable and consistent. So then to your question, you said, how do we do onboarding? Well, by documenting everything, have it ready so you can do the onboarding we used to do it in the office with every Monday. We had an onboarding session for anybody who was new. Now we do it virtually. We have the decks, we do the Zoom meetings, we have the Slack channels open. And then, of course, we take care to make sure we capture their spirits and feelings as well. Like, how are you learning this? What else do you need? What else do you have in mind? So you can't treat the new employees as robots who will understand every piece of written documentation you've done, but you have it there so they can go back to it and search for it at any point. But then you have to really welcome them. Like in a town hall meeting, you have to mention to everybody that you have new people on board. You have to show pictures of them or have them say something. You have to ping them after a few weeks. The normal stuff that you would do in an office, you do it digitally. And when you have a strong documentation of what the company is about, they will quickly, like onboarding is so quick these days. You should have seen onboarding in the 1990s. It was so slow. It's amazing now what you can do, and people are so disciplined with documentation.
That makes a lot of sense. And one last question that kind of branches off what you said before we go to the Q&A. You touched on the idea that software is the ultimate sort of instantiation of human intent. In addition to documentation, I think something I've seen you all talk about before is this idea that the more remote and distributed you are, the more you should try to automate or systematize processes rather than have them be reliant on some set of human actions. Harpi, I know this is something that you guys touched on in the companies you dealt with, where it really forced you to automate more faster. Can you speak a little bit to kind of how you approached that and why that was so important to you?
Sure. So I think the difference is documentation helps you build an internal knowledge base, which is very useful. But I think automating processes and perhaps harmonizing processes helps you get work done faster. So we did this in two ways. I think the single most impactful thing we did was we automated our code development process. So we got to code in continuous integration first so that we could do automated builds. And after we had that, we moved on to continuous delivery. So those were, very worthwhile investments in making the whole team productive. And then the second thing I would say is less on automation, but harmonization, which I think is equally important. We made sure everybody across the company, across the offices, had similar training on how to recruit and evaluate people. So that was very important because we needed to make sure that people were hiring for the same things, for the same cultural values, and so on. So when you joined a company, or when you joined Slice, you were joining Slice. You weren't joining the Odessa office or the New York office, and so on. So I think you want to pick and choose where you invest your resources, but I think there's a certain baseline around harmonizing processes in addition to automation.
That makes a lot of sense. So at this point, we're going to go into the live Q&A. We're going to start with Rachel Horowitz. So Rachel, why don't you unmute yourself, open up your video, and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. My name is Rachel Horowitz. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Caribou Bio. We're a CRISPR genome editing company developing cell therapies for cancer. And I really appreciate you guys already addressing how to have emotionally tough conversations via Zoom. I'm curious if you could talk about the opposite. How do you celebrate as a team? What does it look like to celebrate an exciting event when everyone's working remotely?
I can jump into that one. We've done a global pizza party, which is truly global. We have people in 67 countries. And so we had this Slack thread where everyone could go out to dinner with their family whenever dinner was for them. And then they would post a photo of it. So we had this like 24-hour camera roll of people continuously getting off and going to celebrate with their family. We've actually noticed productivity going up during COVID. And so we've implemented this day called the Family and Friends Day. It's one of our sub values is family and friends first, work second. And we wanted to reiterate that here's a 3-day weekend, do anything other than work. So we started a Slack channel where we encourage people to actually post photos and videos of what they did on those days that wasn't work. And so this kind of harkens back to a point I made earlier, which is none of this was actually person-to-person interactions with each other about work. It was empowering us to go do what is meaningful to us in our remote settings and then sharing it back because it gives you a more holistic view of who people are. Of course, we do virtual happy hours, the kind of usual where it's like, hey, bring your favorite drink or meal and join us in Zoom and we'll just discuss. That's always fun. Zoom actually recently added a new feature where you can share your computer audio. And so oftentimes if we have blocks of time that we aren't in meetings, we'll just get a group of people in a Zoom room and we'll just pass off the DJ duties. Just like if you were in an office and it was 90s Friday or whatever, we just pass around the duties and we're just kind of hanging out with each other in each other's presence. We don't have to look at the camera. We just pass off the DJ duties every now and again. And it's just nice. It's nice to kind of hang out together.
Awesome. Thank you for that question, Rachel.
I could add there maybe on the topic of small celebrations. I agree with Darren said. We have in Slack emojis for all our values, each of the values. So whenever somebody posts some victory of some sort, we can respond with the values that relate to it. And then we respond with 1,000 other emojis. And it looks very celebratory, like fireworks, when you have a lot of colorful emojis and people create their own emojis. And it actually works. It gives you this dopamine that you need for the moment. So a lot of small celebrations are also needed. And then the big ones, like Darren described.
Harpi, you also adopted a thanks or internal, like positive feedback type of mechanism that you saw really successful in your companies, right?
Yeah, that's a shout out awards that I mentioned. And the beauty of it was bottoms up, it was organic. And it could be a database developer thanking somebody because they stayed after work for 4 hours to get this bug fixed. So it could be something very simple. And the other thing on sort of small thank yous that worked really effectively for us was we had this thing called the daily pics or the daily pictures. And this could be somebody saying, hey, we got this shipped, or I took this bike ride and here's a scene, and just a sort of small way of celebrating wins.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Rachel, for that question. Next up, we have Limor Shorts. Limor, go ahead and unmute yourself, open up your video and ask your question.
I hope I did that. Excuse the sore throat. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing. This is so important to us right now. My name is Limor Schwartz. I'm the CFO at Signia. Signia is a cybersecurity and technology company, and we guys are really busy this time. As you probably read, attackers do not rest during Corona as well. And my question is, well, I'm curious to learn from you. We invested so much in creating teamwork and selected talents that have the ability to work fluently in a team. And now we are challenged with giving them the sense of belonging. This is something that I'm really curious to hear your experience on. Thank you.
Harpi or Martin want to go? If not, I'll take it.
It was too hard, Darren. You need to answer it.
All right, sure. So at GitLab, we think about belonging as something that's much broader than I think a lot of people do. And our mission is everyone can contribute. And we literally allow everyone at the company to make a proposal to make any part of our handbook better. For us, that is core to belonging. You belong to the organization because you can make any part of it better, even if it's outside of your space. We have designers that made our onboarding better. So they're not in the people group. They haven't been classically trained in HR, but they had a great idea. They were able to make that proposal and make our onboarding process better. Fundamentally, giving people power to do more things at your company, it really, really goes a long way with belonging. That said, I understand that you're coming at it from a different place because GitLab has the advantage of everyone opting into an all remote environment. Everyone knew what they were getting into when they joined GitLab. There's no surprises. There's an FAQ. I actually added a section that says, what's it like to work at GitLab? People know what they're getting into. So to your point, if you had people join a different culture, a different environment, and now you can't provide that to them, it is upsetting. It is discouraging. One thing I would lean into when travel can resume again is try to get people together, plan a co-working retreat, even if it's multiple retreats with different people in different geographies. In-person matters a lot. Even at GitLab, we try to get the whole company together for a week, a year, just to build relationships and go on excursions together. In-person matters a lot. I think a lot of times in remote teams, people try to figure out solutions without actually meeting people in person. And sometimes the solution is, do the hard work and get people together. And so that's going to be tough right now, but if you can get your team rallied around the reality that we will return to a state where we can do this. We are in the middle of something very difficult, but it had a beginning and it will have an end. And it's getting through that middle that will really galvanize the team. And I would say go ahead and proactively plan something on the other side of it. At GitLab, we're already planning future sales kickoffs. We're already planning future GitLab commits and GitLab contributes. It is amazing what happens just to put something on the calendar, even if it's 9 months out. Circle this, I'm going to Vancouver. It matters.
Limor, I'd offer just one thing that I thought was very effective for us. My co-founder, he led a series of engineering culture discussions. What we did was Spotify published these discussions on engineering culture at Spotify. And they were very thought-provoking. And periodically, he would bring the team together to listen to those discussions and think about, okay, here's our culture. We are growing. Where do we want it to go? And that gave everybody a voice into the culture of the company. Who do we want to be when we grow up? And I thought that, among other things, was just one of the things that engendered a lot of sense of belonging.
Thank you, Limor.
Thank you so much. Great ideas. Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Ofer Yehudai. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologize if not. Please unmute and ask your question.
Not bad, not bad. By the way, Ofer in Hebrew is a baby deer, like Bambi, the Disney movie, just for general context. Hi, guys. I'm president at Fiber. We work with some of the largest gaming companies on UA and monetization. We are about 300 employees across 7 offices. And to be honest, we never planned to be a remote company. We invested in offices and talent and procedures. So my question, I guess, for you, Harp, and the team can help. Do you have any tips for this not here, not there scenario, like hybrid? You know, we have some offices like in Tel Aviv and Berlin. When people are back to work, while I'm in California, we're not going back to the office anytime soon, not in New York as well. So what do you do when some of your teammates are back to work, some don't see like the end of it, and we are still in this limbo? I mean, any experience or any tips that, you know, you guys can share would be appreciated.
And Ofer, sorry, is the context here that you guys have been able to get together in the past? So you have that sort of person-to-person relationship already in the bank?
Yes, absolutely. That's how we used to work up until, you know, just a few months.
And, you know, we are seeing that actually a number of our companies, you know, they have offices in Israel where they're opening and offices in US which are not opening. And I think the number one thing is people here are trying to learn from what is working, what is not working in Israel. And I think there's something powerful about that. I think the teams can sort of help each other. And hopefully this doesn't last too long, but especially if you worked together in the past, I think you already have the currency in the bank to sort of capitalize on that and work through this environment. I don't have a different answer for what would you do in the next 2 or 3 months.
And maybe
Darren, Martin?
One thing I'll offer is that hybrid remote is extremely difficult. There's just no sugarcoating it. You're fundamentally managing an on-site experience and an off-site experience. My recommendation is if you've done well as an all remote company, start unwinding the offices. I know it's going to look weird in the short term, but you de-risk your company in a big way and you make sure that there's a level playing field. If you keep the executives out of the office, the remote fluency, the remote muscle you're building during this time, you will continue to build it. If everyone just rushes back into the office, you haven't really taken advantage of what this has been. It's like a beta test of having anybody anywhere. I think the core thing to keep in mind here is that if you're going to keep the office back open, question why you're doing that. But if you do it, the office has to be just another place you go to work remotely. No office can have any more importance than an airplane seat, a hotel room, a WeWork, someone's spare bedroom. The culture can't be defined by the office. The culture can't be defined by the paint on the wall or what neighborhood you're in. The culture has to be the values and how people treat each other. this is hard, if not impossible, to pull off in a hybrid setting, because people on both sides have interesting viewpoints about this. People that go into the office, look at the remoters and think they should work harder because they didn't have a commute, which is whatever it is. The people outside of the office look at the people in the office and think, oh, they've got it made in there. They don't miss out on any hallway conversations. So this is why having two parallel experiences happening at the same time is going to be more difficult long-term. And that's why I think a lot of companies right now are like, hey, remote, even in a pandemic, has been okay, but it's mostly because they're all remote. And once you start getting some people back in the office, you introduce all sorts of new variables that you didn't have when everyone was out of the office. This is a much deeper conversation than I can answer in 4 minutes, but hopefully that gives you some context.
No, it does. Thank you.
If you need somebody who believes in the hybrid model, turn to me. I actually believe it is fully doable, not as difficult as Darren says, but I love the conversation here. And I believe in it because humans are different, and the best businesses can make use of different people. And sure, you have to bridge the difference between the physical and the virtual, but Darren said it. No office space must be worth more than a hotel a room or an airplane seat, and that is the key to it. And it is the leadership that makes it happen, the CEO and the leadership team that makes sure that nobody is privileged based on their location. And then I believe it can work, and it did work very well at MySQL and other companies I've run.
Thank you, Martin. I may look you up after the webinar for some more tips. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Ofer. Next up, we have Celestine Schnug. Celestine, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey guys, so I have a question for Darren and Martin. So companies right now are definitely almost this place of safety and this sense of security. Sorry, let me turn on my video. Okay, hello. So in the time of COVID, companies right now are this place of safety and security. And we're encouraging our teams to be super vulnerable, but often issues come up, whether it's personal challenges or even health challenges. How do you guys see your role as CEO in actually solving these issues for your team and taking care of them? And do you think it's your responsibility to do that?
Martin, you want to lead?
Yes, I am very particular on this topic. I believe that every human being is intended to be responsible for themselves. And when you are at the age that you can work full-time for a company, you're an adult, so you take care of yourself. And nothing can change that. That said, I believe that good leaders will engage in that question and be helpful. And I think we need to do more of it, where we step in and we provide the framework, allow the discussion, allow people to show vulnerabilities, allow them to say whatever is on their mind, and not punish them for it and not make it bad. But I will draw the line there with who is in charge, because I don't believe society can work unless people are essentially taking care of themselves. And there's a risk sometimes of victimization, where people say they don't feel they have the agency to affect themselves or their work environment. I don't believe so. I think you always have it, and I'm trying to instill it. But I also want the culture to be such that there's nothing wrong in crying in a meeting, swearing in a meeting. There's nothing wrong in saying, I'm done, I have to stop my meetings for today, I'm burnt out or something. And we don't make a fuss about it, and then we allow people to be whole, come back, and it's acceptable. So that's how I view it. I do think it probably varies from leader to leader how they really look at it. Over to you, Darren.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, I agree with all of that. We try to hire managers of one, and this ties into it. I would just say Google GitLab mental health. We've built a page on how we think about that. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen it kind of escalate at GitLab. And so we implemented a family and friends day where we just allow people, here is this day, do not work. Every single person is going to use that differently. Their vision of wellness is going to be different from person to person. We would rather just give them the space. And then of course we give them coaching and other things. We can pair them with professionals if they need therapy and other kinds of things like that. but we don't have any on staff. So we just make sure that the network is there for them to tap into.
Awesome. Thank you, Celestine, for your question. I think we're just about at time here, so I'll go ahead and wrap up. I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions. There's so many. But the good news is there's a lot of additional resources on this topic, and so we'll send out a link afterwards with many of these. First of all, I just want to thank all the panelists, Darren, Marten, Harpi. I found this extremely informative and useful. I hope all the attendees did as well. I think what was maybe most inspiring for me is a lot of the things we've talked about, from culture to documentation to meetings, and developing empathy for your team, et cetera, with intentionality. Those are things that maybe are especially important in a remote environment, but really any company, any team could apply them. And so even if you're a company who's going to resume back being co-located after COVID, we hope you find these tips really useful and that they improve your organization's ability to succeed moving forward. In terms of next steps, look out for a follow-up from us. We'll be sending an email. We'll have a recording of this. We may have a transcript as well with some synthesized takeaways. And then finally, we'll link to a number of the additional best resources online, many of which have been written by Darren and Marten and GitLab and MySQL on this topic. So if this piqued your interest and you want to learn even more about how to operate in these environments, look out for that. So with that said, we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you everyone for attending. We hope you found this really useful.
Thank you, Davis. You were an excellent moderator.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Agreed.
Thank you guys. Thanks,
Davis.
Marten. Thank you, Darren. Thanks, Davis.
Good to meet you, Harpi. And good seeing you, Darren.
Yeah. Good seeing you guys.
Absolutely. This was fun.
Thank you.